and welcome to the Creative Mind podcast, where I discuss psychology and its influence on culture from a Christian perspective. I'm Ashley Hagman. I am a therapist and an adjunct professor of psychology. Today, we're going to be discussing depression and depression rates, and so we're going to all get very sad, but I promise I will not leave you there. We will then discuss existential therapy, which is a theory of how to conceptualize specifically depression, but really, a lot of mental health disorders, how to conceptualize it and how to treat it. And then we're going to discuss through the book of Ecclesiastes what scripture has to say about the ideas presented in the theory of existential therapy. First of all, the rates of depression have been increasing for a very long time. I remember early in my career, I was maybe maybe like 2 years into practice. I went to a training. This was probably about 8 years ago now. I went to a training on suicidality, and at the time, they were presenting the research that had been done on suicide rates, suicide attempts, and depression rates. And I was floored. I was shocked by the prevalence and how much it's been increasing. And that was, 8 years ago now, and that's old news. So today it has sharply increased. Well, the first thing we saw was during COVID, there was a huge uptick in the rates of depression. Now, of course, that's pretty reasonable. I mean, we were all had a lot of fear. So fear of death, fear of the death of our loved ones, and we were in isolation. We experienced social isolation, and beyond just the physical isolation of not being able to be with people, there was, of course, a lot of controversy over how to respond to the virus. So there's a lot of relational controversy and broken relationships. And then to top it all off, the cultural issues that were going on as well in the world. So that was a historical time of trial for really the world, but especially for America. And so, of course, we saw increased rates of depression. And I'll include a link to this graph in the show notes that I'm looking at. You can see, that the rates of depression are steadily rising, 2015 to 2020, and then 2020 hits, and you see a sharp rise in the rates of depression. And I'll give you some numbers in a minute. But then you would think, okay, well, maybe that, once things resolve, once things open up, we would expect to see that trend go down. And that's kind of what happened. So let's look at 2015, we have the rate of lifetime depression. So this is people who have been asked, has a doctor or nurse ever told you that you have depression? So these are people that are self-reporting that they've been diagnosed with depression. The rates in 2015 are 19.6%. The rates in early 2020, it rises gradually to 22.9%. At the end of 2020, it jumps to 25.2%. In 2021, it peaks at 28.6%. So then you would predict from there, it'd be reasonable to assume like, okay, the rates might go down. And that actually did happen. So we went from our high at 28.6%, and it starts to slowly taper down to 26.9%. But then in 2022, we see another gradual uptick, and we are now at an all-time high of 29.0% of the population saying that they have been diagnosed at one point in their life with depression. That is 1 in 3 people that you know that have been diagnosed with depression. That is a doctor or nurse has told you that you have depression. In many cases, a lot of people don't disclose their depression. They don't get diagnosed. And I think that that's becoming less and less common. I think more people are feeling more comfortable with reaching out for help, but there's still a lot that are undiagnosed. So I think that is shocking to me, absolutely just flooring. And to put this a little bit into perspective, I looked up the rates of depression in 2000, so that's 23 years ago now, and they were somewhere. There's different studies that have different numbers, but anywhere between 2 and 4%. So let me just let that sink in. So we went from in 2000, 2 to 4%, somewhere there in the low single digits, to 30% of people. absolutely flooring. And we're seeing the rates of suicide also tick up at the same time. And it's heartbreaking. It's absolutely heartbreaking. And so we need to have this discussion. And what I hope that I can leave for you guys in this, I know you're most of who's listening to this are probably not going to be clinicians, but look around you in your life. Look around you and just notice the people that are having a hard time and do your best to be there for you. And we're going to be there for them. And we're going to talk a little bit more about maybe how to go about that and some ideas to work through that. And I think one resource for that is conceptualizing depression from this theory of existential therapy. And again, we're going to sort through this because not all of what existential therapy has to say is true and helpful. But I do think that there are some really beneficial components of this that I think can help us in treating and responding to those around us suffering from depression. Yeah, so the theory of existential therapy, basically the idea is that there are certain conditions that are inherent to the human experience that oftentimes we try not to think about, we try not to, we push it away, we distract ourselves, but eventually at some point in our lives, we are confronted with these conditions of humanity. And, if we are not dealing with them in an appropriate way, that's what passes into the point of dysfunction, and that's what passes into the point of mental illness. So these conditions are, first of all, freedom and the associated responsibility with that. So this is something I see a lot with, I work personally a lot with teens and young adults, and this is kind of where they're at. They're at a place where, yeah, they're starting to have freedom, but that also means that you have to be an adult and you have to make adult choices. And so it's the question of what choice should I make? Where should I go? And kind of this agonizing of it's up to me now, which is really difficult. The second one is isolation. And this is kind of this existential isolation that even when you're in a close relationship with somebody, each man is an island unto themselves. Like nobody can completely understand you. Nobody can get in your mind and see things the way that you do. There's always conflict. You're always going to have distance in a relationship to some point. No one is ever going to know you completely and be able to, yeah, understand you completely. So we are, islands unto ourselves. And that is extremely feeds into depression and is this feeling of isolation and this awareness of the division between people. Third one is meaninglessness. So feeling that you go about your day-to-day life, but what's the point? What is the point of everything that we're doing on this earth? I work, but it's just just for money so I can eat or do the fun things, but what's the point of those fun things? And then that comes into the last condition, and that is death. So what is the point of all the things that I do in this world because I'm gonna die? It's all so fleeting, and what is the point of trying to make good decisions, or what should my life be directed towards? Because I'm going to be here one day and I'm not the next. So there's dysfunction that happens when we are trying to avoid these conditions. So a lot of times it's like, if you're trying to avoid your freedom and associated responsibility, you're acting in like a prolonged childhood. So you're pursuing things that where you're maybe not making choices, but in not making choices, you're making bad ones usually. Or you're trying to dissociate, you're trying to get away from these thoughts, drugs, alcohol, avoidance, media consumption, over media consumption, disconnection from other people, so that you can just be free, and not have to think about it and push it away. Yeah, the same thing with death, meaninglessness, isolation. But then you can also pass, once you are confronted with these things and you're not able to push them down anymore, then it can pass into the point of dysfunction when you have too much anxiety, too much death anxiety, which then eventually leads to depression, too much despair. So the goal of existential therapy is to get people to acknowledge these things and face up to these realities because they are realities in our lives, and yet to not be overcome by them and not to be paralyzed with fear and overcome with despair. They do this by emphasizing free will, emphasizing choice and freedom and responsibility, and the fact that you can do things in your life to to have a good life. So this feeling of agency and self-direction, and then also they want to push you to act authentically, to accept the reality and confront the reality and be okay with it. So it's making active choices instead of avoiding things and stunting your growth. But it is living your life. It's they would try and seek to find something of meaning in your life, be it work, be it relationships. Just pick something that feels meaningful to you and pursue those things. So, a big emphasis is on trying to identify wise ways of living your life and to avoid kind of these self destructive, childish things. And yet, there is no, so most existential therapy models do not have any kind of metaphysics, they don't have any kind of afterlife, so they view things as, try to find the ways that you can have the best quality of life on earth for the longest amount of time that you can, because that's all we can do. So there are some things that I think are valuable in existential therapy. So the first one is that there is a reality in life that we are going to die. And I think we do that, and that we do, apart from God, there is no meaning in our life. And we are isolated. Like sin isolates us. We cannot have these close intimate relationships that we could have had before sin. There's always going to be conflict. We're always ultimately alone in our lives. And the world is a scary place. There's a lot of evil, and so the freedom that you have to make choices is also somewhat of a curse of what if I make the wrong one and then my life is screwed up. So I think that it is important in working through, someone, and I think that's where, if you've ever experienced depression, and been through a really hard time, you're aware of these things. You have a heightened awareness of the brokenness in this world. You have a heightened awareness of how evil things are, how bad they are, and you are more confronted with the idea of death and the finitude of life, and especially if you're having thoughts of what if I'm not here and what's the point of my life. I think that that's actually an important questions to ask, is to confront these things and not just try to push them away and not try to avoid them. And I think when we are, in our relationships talking with people, we should be kind of challenging them to think through these ultimate things of life, and think through, what is the point of your everyday? What is the direction? What is your goal? What is all of this for? So I think that's where this therapy has a really strong start to things. So an awareness of the brokenness and sin in the world, and the idea that we need to be aware of that and confront those things. However, it really kind of lands in a hopeless place, like there's nothing more. So I'm gonna start in with the book of Ecclesiastes and explain what I mean about how existential therapy really lines up well with the themes in this book. So first of all, I want to read with you. I wish I could just read this whole book. To be honest, it's so good, and I really recommend, if this is like hitting you, go back, read all of Ecclesiastes. It's gonna be very fruitful for you. But I am gonna read an extended passage here, chapter 1, verses 1 through 11. So the words of the preacher, the son of David, king in Jerusalem. Vanity of vanities, says the preacher, vanity of vanities, all is vanity. What does man gain by all the toil at which he toils under the sun? A generation goes and a generation comes, but the earth remains forever. The sun rises and the sun goes down and hastens to the place where it rises. The wind blows to the south and goes around to the north. Around and around the wind goes, and on its circuit the wind returns. All streams run to the sea, but the sea is not full. To the place where the streams flow, there they flow again. All things are full of weariness, and a man cannot utter it. The eye is not satisfied with seeing, nor the ear filled with hearing. What has been, is what will be, and what has been done is what will be done. There is nothing new under the sun. Is there a thing of which it is said, see, this is new? It has been already in the ages before us. There is no remembrance of former things, nor will there be any remembrance of later things yet to be among those who come after. So it's this idea of, what can I offer this world? Things just happen over and over again. And of the millions and millions of people that have existed and the millions and millions of ideas that have come to fruition, Like, do I have anything new to offer? And usually the answer is no. That there's, other people that can do the same things that I do and that have thought much smarter things than I have thought. And when I die, even if I was able to contribute something to this world, eventually I will be forgotten. I will be gone. There will be nothing left. And so what even is the point? And so yeah, so it's this confrontation with these ultimate things of life, this recognition of the anxiety of death and the reality of the wrongness of death. And I think it's important to push head into those thoughts. However, it's important to not leave ourselves there. So, through the book of Ecclesiastes, this was likely written by Solomon. He goes through, okay, so he has this problem of death and of meaninglessness. And so he tries many things to try and assuage these feelings of despair. So the first thing is wisdom. He looks to wisdom and trying to be as wise as he can to figure out the world. And he finds that for in much wisdom is much vexation, and he who increases knowledge increases sorrow. So as he grows in wisdom, he's actually not growing in any joy, he's actually growing in sorrow. He then turns to self-indulgence, and it's kind of this idea of eat and drink for tomorrow we die. So just anything to fill your stomach, drunkenness, sex, anything that feels good. I think that the good motto for that is, "I'm not here for a long time, I'm here for a good time." But all of that is vanity, and at the end of the day, you go to bed, those thoughts are coming back to you. You can't avoid them, that's the way it is. And then he turns to work, and that brings him nothing. He turns to wealth and honor, and that also is dust in his mouth, vanity of vanities. It doesn't seem to bring the meaning that he is hoping for. And then finally he gets to kind of the ending place that existential therapy has to offer, and that is chapter 7, verse 17. Be not overly wicked, neither be a fool. Why should you die before your time? So it's kind of just this like, try to be wise, try to make the best decisions that you can, because why should you die before your time? At least, make the most of the life that you're in and don't be stupid. But but then we see in chapter 8, verse 14, there is a vanity that takes place on earth, that there are righteous people to whom it happens according to the deeds of the wicked, and there are wicked people to whom it happens according to the deeds of the righteous. I said that this is also vanity. So even if you try to be as wise as possible and try to be righteous and try to live a good life so that you can have quality for as long as possible, you could get hit by a bus tomorrow, or you could have all sorts of, unfortunate things that happen to you that maybe you didn't even deserve. And yet the wicked people seem to prosper as well. The answer to existentialism doesn't, existential therapy, which is different than existential philosophy. So there's some differences there. But anyways, it doesn't it doesn't satisfy. It doesn't answer the question. There's still something else that we need in our lives. And the end of Ecclesiastes, I think, really sums this up. And that is, he concludes after this whole journey of trying to seek the meaning in his life, he concludes with chapter 12, verses 13. The end of the matter, all has been heard. Fear God and keep his commandments, for this is the whole duty of man. For God will bring every deed into judgment with every secret thing, whether good or evil. And this is Old Testament, so this is before we have the hope and the promise of Christ. But ultimately, the idea is that we can only have meaning because, in as much as we are directed towards the living eternal God who knows all things eternally and will judge the living and the dead. And ultimately the hope of heaven that we will have an afterlife. But that life resides in the living eternal God. And so I think as you are processing these thoughts of depression, maybe in yourself, maybe you're experiencing these feelings of hopelessness and despair, or you're walking through this with a loved one and a family member, yeah, like, it's legitimate, it's legitimate that those negative thoughts, some of them are legitimate, that things are hard in this world, and you have that heightened awareness of some of this truth. And not all of it is true, there's a lot of distortions there, and there's a lot of positive things too. But anyways, yeah, there is a sense in which, yeah, we are gonna die tomorrow, so what's the point? Unless you have this hope, and unless your life is directed towards and considering God. And so faith is such a rich resource in depression, in getting through depression. And I've found in my work that, the difference between somebody, choosing to end their own life and not is honestly a lot of times just the smallest glimmer of hope, the smallest thought of something good that keeps them from actually harming themselves. And if just the smallest hope can do that, then what if we were able to remind people and help them cling to this ultimate, this beautiful, incredible hope that we have in the perfect kingdom and person of God and the love that he has for us. And so, yeah, don't be afraid to wade into these feelings with those who are struggling, and you yourself. Don't be afraid to confront your fear of death. Don't be afraid to confront these thoughts of isolation, but don't stay there. Don't stay in those thoughts. Like, fight back against it. Meditate on these truths of the kingdom and of our, ultimate direction in life, because that is what gives all of life meaning. So the fact that there is an eternal living God who cares about us, who loves us, and who's promised us life for those who believe gives meaning to everything. So when we are cleaning toilets, when we are making our meal, when we are doing the same thing day after day after day, but it's directed towards his kingdom and towards his glory, then even those little things have meaning, great meaning, a weight of purpose to it. And that is what makes life beautiful. And I know, I say all this not to say that, oh, those of faith don't struggle with depression, because that's absolutely not true. Scripture is rife with people who are in true despair. I mean, look at David, look at Christ, in the garden. Yeah, so there is absolute despair, absolute depression out there, even in those who are righteous and pursuing God. However, our faith gives us such a foundation for fighting back against those feelings of depression and struggling through it and making it through and getting to the other side, because there is another side. There is hope. Things will get better in this life or in the next, but they will absolutely get better. But don't dismiss people who are struggling with these things. I think they're legitimate questions to ask. We should legitimately be thinking about these, but also don't leave them in that. Don't leave them in the hopelessness. In love, as appropriate, remind them of the beauty of their hope in Christ Jesus. And sometimes I will say, when I myself have been struggling with feeling down, my husband tries to speak these truths to me, and at the time I'm like, you get to a point, honestly, where you don't want to feel bad, and you don't want to do the things that will help you feel better. But the fact that he said those things, maybe in the moment I'm really resistant to, but then later, as I have thought through them and processed them, because I know he's saying them to me in love and he's not dismissing my emotions, but he's sitting with me and then reminding me of truths. I think through them later, and God uses that fodder in my mind, that food of meditation in my mind, to bring about that truth to fruition in a way that gives me hope. So yeah, so I hope that this is helpful for you, whether you're processing through depression yourself or again, walking through it with a loved one. I hope this encourages you to help you understand depression in a better way, and maybe gives you a little bit of tools to respond to that and to help people. And ultimately, yeah, just please be aware of the people around you in your life who may be struggling, and don't be afraid to be there for them. Don't be afraid to ask them hard questions, ask them genuinely how they're doing, and yeah, be on the lookout for those people because they're out there.
And thank you for listening to the Created Mind podcast. If you like what you heard, be sure to check out my e-course. The link is in the description. In that course, I go through how to understand psychology from a Christian perspective using the framework of systematic theology. So hopefully that's interesting to you. There's a preview on there to see if that's something that is up your alley, something that you want to listen to. Also, be sure to subscribe, to leave a review, and to tell your friends about the podcast. All of that is really helpful and just helps us reach more ears. So all that being said, blessings to you as you go about your week.